Hi, everyone. Well, adding to the built environment theme, our next session explores the intersection of climate change and infrastructure. I'd like to introduce now the next panel's moderator, Karen Apple, Climate Adaptation Lead, AECOM Metro New York, who will lead a discussion around the engineering, warning systems, and infrastructure commitments required to keep communities safe. Welcome to this next panel.
I'm just going to open this now. Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to be here. Thank you to the NESS Summit for having us. We have an exciting session planned today to talk about the intersection of climate change and infrastructure. I'm really happy to moderate this panel that has a lot of different backgrounds and perspectives and stories to tell you. And just to give you a little bit of a table of contents of what we're going to discuss today, we're going to first talk about the impacts that we've seen in our experiences with climate change and its impact on infrastructure. Also, we're going to talk about what we think is important to consider when tackling the complexities that, that can occur when these two important pieces of our lives intersect. We're going to touch on things that we're currently working on that we view as successes in solving the problems that climate change impacts are having. And then we're going to conclude with ideas that we think are important as we move towards, or try to move towards, a more resilient life in an urban metropolis like New York City. And this is a local crowd here, so we're New York City, New Jersey representatives. So we're psyched about that. We hope that you can come out of this with some new ideas to collaborate and take action in your own work and within your organizations. I know a lot of the panels today have been focused on calls to action, and this will be a little bit different perspective, focused on infrastructure, but hopefully we'll give you some new things to think about. So before we get started, we just want to give you some brief intros so you know where we're coming from. I'll start. My name's Karen Apple, as that was already said, and I'm with AECOM. I'm one of our climate adaptation leads in the New York metro area. My current claim to fame is I'm the project manager and engineer of record for New Jersey DEP's Rebuild by Design Hudson River project, so across the river in Hoboken and Weehawken and in Jersey City, where we've been working on the final design for almost a 2-mile-long flood wall for coastal flood risk management. We're in the bidding phase right now, and we hope to be in construction in early 2023. So I've been working on that since 2017, so to have something come into bidding and construction is really exciting. Keith.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Keith Masback. I'm a 30-year national security professional representing Tomorrow.io, which is a climate intelligence company, weather analytics, that is also going to space. So that's most of my background has to do with remote sensing, Tom Clancy type jobs, and over the course of the discussion, we'll get to connect the dots about why a spy satellite guy is sitting up here talking about weather and climate and resilience.
Thanks. I'm BJ Jones. I'm president and CEO of the Battery Park City Authority, and am also happy to be here. The authority is responsible for developing and maintaining the Battery Park City neighborhood in Lower Manhattan along the Hudson River. We have over 16,000 residents, over 30 residential buildings, 10 million square feet of commercial space, and 36 acres of park space, schools, cultural institutions, and more. And we are setting out to protect all of that and help protect Lower Manhattan with resiliency initiatives.
I'm Courtney Worrell. I'm the president and CEO of the nonprofit, the Waterfront Alliance. We are a nonprofit that serves all of the coastline of the 5 boroughs of New York City and northern New Jersey, and that amounts to almost 1,600 linear miles of waterfront. This is a very water-bound area. We advocate for everything from the maritime industry. If you can think of all of the heterogeneous uses that there are in a metropolitan area like this surrounded by water, we advocate for everything from the maritime industry and ports to wetlands preservation and parks, everything in between. Climate change is pretty much ground zero at our coastlines and where water meets land, and so we have a very strong focus of our programs and our initiatives on climate resiliency and climate change.
All right, so 2022, as many of you who are local folks, or at least local to the Northeast know, marks the anniversary of two unprecedented events. This past August was the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Ida, and we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy in October. So these storms were two very different events that had considerable and very visible impacts on the basic infrastructure of our communities and our community members themselves. But we all know there are other climate change impacts, extreme heat, sea level rise, drought, that are becoming more prevalent in urban metropolises like New York City. So BJ, we're gonna start with you. The question is, how did these specific storms or other climate change events impact the infrastructure relevant to your organization?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about it in terms of Sandy, since we're approaching the 10-year anniversary, and that was really an impetus for us to take more aggressive climate action. As I had mentioned, Battery Park City is often thought of kind of an urban development model with everything that's happening in that neighborhood. But when I think about it, I like to kind of zoom in and think about public spaces like the Battery Park City ball fields, which were completely wiped out during Hurricane Sandy, and the imperative to get those ball fields restored as quickly as possible. And I think about that because it certainly showed how vulnerable we are, but it also demonstrated how important public space is, in addition to jobs and lives and the economy, all of the infrastructure, all the things we're trying to protect. That storm damage can be very personal. It can be at the community level, not just the city level and the state level. And so, that certainly made us mindful of our vulnerability as a coastal community, and certainly motivated us to come up with a plan for flood protection for the neighborhood, but also to think a bit more proactively from a sustainability perspective too. So climate adaptation, but also climate action, and setting forth on a sustainability plan, for a carbon neutral neighborhood to bolster energy efficiency, water conservation, waste reduction, and more.
Great, thanks. Courtney, what about you?
So before Hurricane Sandy, a lot of the nonprofits that work on ecological restoration, environmental protection, were focused on the continued restoration of the region from its post-industrial landscape to a modern and ecologically healthy coastline and waterfront. But what Hurricane Sandy did is it really focused the attention on the fact that those areas not only need to be ecologically restored and brought back, but we have to prepare for these major impacts from climate change. And then what happened with Hurricane Ida, is that the realization of flooding as just a coastal issue was shifted to inland. So we realized that climate impacts, extreme rainfall, were not just going to be affecting the coastlines most, but also inland communities. And Hurricane Sandy did a bit of that as well, but I think the focus of the advocacy community really shifted to a much more comprehensive, multi-hazard look at what climate change was going to do to our region. And actually, I'll say, Karen, I do have some action items for people at the end. So
Nice, good,
there's
good.
Definitely a lot of advocacy needed for climate resiliency. Yeah.
Keith, what about you?
So these are very personal storms for me. Living in northern New Jersey, we're sort of at ground zero for Hurricane Sandy. And we did have the knowledge, we did have the foreknowledge of the left turn, for those of you that remember that this hurricane made a 90-degree turn. It was sort of made no sense, but we saw it coming up the coast. The left turn was predicted when it came inland across Staten Island and into New Jersey. And that was a pretty significant emotional event for me and our 5 kids, with 11 trees down and out of power for about 2 weeks. So fast forward last year, I was in the midst of selling our family home, downsizing, and during Ida, so this massive storm hits the Gulf Coast, but somehow does more damage in New Jersey than it does in Louisiana, right? Just fascinating how that all played out. But I happened to own 2 homes at that moment because I was in stride of selling and buying. And so that, again, was a very emotional moment, trying to make sure that my buyers were going to be set and that the home I was headed to was okay. The story here, through the lens of the type of technology that we work with at tomorrow.io, is being able to act and not react. We are often feeling like we're victims of weather, but when we can have foreknowledge, when we can understand, be predictive, and use advanced analytics and use the types of sensing that has increasingly become available. The reason, again, one of the reasons I'm associated with this activity is that for 20 years we were at war developing technologies, spending a great deal of money doing so, and things that were heretofore just applied to national security issues are now available to a broad range of sectors across the economy. And one of those certainly has to do with climate and being able to, again, be anticipatory and predictive and not just reactive.
And Keith, it's not just about a storm that's coming too. You can look at things like heat and drought and predict those types of events as well.
Absolutely. And part of the problem, sort of the problem that most people aren't aware of, is that our infrastructure in space is sort of atrophying at the national level. Countries have not kept up with space assets to understand and characterize weather. And on the ground, the assets that we kind of take for granted, especially in the New York metropolitan area, are really only in a few very developed parts of the world. So there are entire swaths of the planet that do not have reliable, actionable weather data. And if you don't have the data, you can't get to the analytics and the information and the warning, be that across the wide range of climate activities.
So, as you can all see, we're all from different industries, right? Consultants, engineering, technology, a government entity, and an NGO. And we have different perspectives on the success of combating climate change. So I'd like to know, what is one thing you are currently working on or see as key to solving the problems that climate change is creating? And more importantly, why? Courtney, do you want to start us off?
There's so many.
I know, you only have a couple minutes.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that's really important is to recognize that infrastructure is going to be built for climate resilience in equitable ways if we aren't conscientious about protecting the most vulnerable communities that are vulnerable to climate hazards, but also have the least resources to protect themselves. So right now, the model has been up to this point that a lot of the infrastructure projects are being built where the highest tax bases are, and that makes a lot of sense. New York City needs the revenue. We can't lose Lower Manhattan and expect the city to function over time. But what we need to do is to shift towards looking at where entire communities are threatened. There are multiple pathways for that to happen, but the advocacy community really needs to continue to be watching that and guiding and steering the agencies and the organizations, the governmental organizations that are responsible for that decision making, or we could have outcomes that are extremely inequitable. So I think that's one of the main things that we're thinking about.
BJ.
Yeah, I think a lot about the importance of being part of a comprehensive strategy when it comes to resiliency projects. None of these projects should be done completely in isolation. Even just for a neighborhood like ours, it's a vital link in a chain of protective measures that are necessary to protect Lower Manhattan. And so having the Lower Manhattan coastal resiliency initiative is kind of an overarching guide for how we approach this. is really important. And you know, I think too, like to Courtney's point, is that, you know, this isn't a zero-sum game. Like, all of these projects have to happen. They may not necessarily happen at the same time, but there's got to be a comprehensive plan for how we're going to get all of it done. And for the projects that are done first, how do we utilize the lessons learned from that to help in these other communities that you know, are coming online next to get these things done as effectively as possible.
So as a moderator, I'm going to get on a little soapbox and kind of follow that. Mine would be built projects. So it's interesting that you said that. You know, when it comes to infrastructure, we need the plans and the studies and the data and the policy, but if we don't start building things, it's not going to matter. And I think, you know, what you're saying, Courtney, is really important with the environmental justice and the equitability. But small things like rain gardens or retrofitting buildings with deployable floodgates. I was talking to Alan Steele, and he was mentioning that there are floodgates here at Javits Center that are deployed or can be deployed when there's a storm event. Or resilient parks, those are happening in Hoboken. I used to live in Hoboken. Or large projects like the Big U or RBDH. But I think it's interesting how long things take, right? So I mentioned I was working on my project since 2017, and there was a feasibility study before that, and that came out of Superstorm Sandy. And now what's happening is we're getting a lot more projects that are coming out of Ida. But it takes a while to get these things built. So I think the built projects, getting them in the ground, they may not be perfect, but as we build, we can learn more and have lessons learned, and then those can inform the next projects. But then also, the smaller projects can have a bigger impact now. Anything to add, Keith?
Yeah, I think it's the idea that these phenomenal efforts that we're doing to recognize and put in to create mitigation efforts and to recognize that this is happening and these commitment to the types of long-term projects that you've all addressed, is that that's not mutually exclusive from being able to deal with the right now. As I used to want to explain, commanders in the military all fancy themselves as Sun Tzu or Napoleon, and they make these beautiful plans. And often as the intelligence officer, you have to go and say, you know, the enemy doesn't respect your plan. The enemy gets a vote. And in this case, the enemy is sort of the weather, right? And so the weather gets a vote now, and the weather isn't going to wait. The climate isn't going to wait until we're ready with these long-term projects. So how are we able to use data and information and advanced analytics and sensing to make sure we are prepared now, even as we prepare for the long term?
So in prepping for this session, we had a couple of discussions, and one of the things that came up was the complexities when tackling the impacts of climate change, especially on urban infrastructure. In a large metropolitan area like New York City. And, you know, of course, public safety is key. That's the most important life and limb. But we also have to consider public health and the natural environment. You know, that's something that you talked about, Courtney, that came before Sandy. There was a big focus on ecosystem restoration and wetland restoration. Not just because it could protect, but also because it was, you know, good for the environment, which was then good for public health. And, you know, the density of the urban infrastructure, I don't know if you've ever walked by a construction site and looked down. I mean, your mind would be blown if you've never seen it before, right? There's like every single color pipe and conduit and, you know, that you can see, and having to build in that is very complex. And then the population density too, right? Trying to build within the services that need to be provided by the infrastructure. And then just having, you know, people, like BJ was saying, deal with those projects. So I guess my question would be now, what is at the forefront of your considerations when you're addressing the complexities of climate change impacts? You want to start us off, Keith?
Well, I like the idea of sort of what's represented up here. We talked about that prior to the panel. It's going to take a village. It's going to take communities. It's going to take governments. It's going to take non-governmental organizations. It's going to take large engineering firms, and it's going to take advanced technology to move at the speed that we need to do to manage this. This is no longer a problem that's coming or that's on the horizon. Unfortunately, it's here, and you don't need anything more than Katrina and Rita and Sandy and Ida, and really daily events that we all can sense that in our lifetime things have changed and continue to change. So the types of public-private partnerships are absolutely critical here. I don't, as we mentioned, I think BJ said it, none of this happens without an alignment across all of these. I guess Benjamin Franklin, right? We should hang together, for surely we will hang separately. Right?
Good. Do you have anything to add, BJ?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, I'm pretty focused on just making sure that Battery Park City is built to last. We're a coastal community, I keep saying it, but we're literally built into the water. The shoreline was extended to create Battery Park City. And, I think that, to your point earlier, Karen, about action and, making things happen while we're trying to plan and what have you, I think it's, important to do what you can where you are to become more and more resilient with each passing year. And so while we were planning, much larger scale resiliency designs for the whole neighborhood, we were also making use of interim resiliency measures, where we focused first was a very site-specific project right at those ball fields that I was talking about at the outset. And so now, we've completed in the past year a flood barrier system that protects those ball fields and the adjacent community center. And so we're just kind of trying to build on top of each, piece of progress that we make to do what we can, because you can't wait to figure it all out and make it all perfect.
Right.
You do have to take some action in the interim while you're coming up with a sensible solution.
Well, I guess I would say that, and maybe this is an opportunity for BJ to say a bit more, but these projects don't come without controversy. They're hard, and they're hard partly from what Karen was saying. There's so much complexity in the infrastructure in a highly dense environment like New York City, and in other areas across the country as well. And so one of the things that we have, Waterfront Alliance and our coalition, the Rise to Resilience Coalition, has found ourselves in the place of is saying something to the effect of, look, change is coming. Either we're going to be a part of that change and help manage and guide and live with that change, or the change will happen and then we'll have to just deal with it. And so I think that one of the things that we're thinking a lot about right now is how can we move forward the conversation about public participation processes that are inherently important to any type of infrastructure project, making sure that they are enhancing the outcome, but also that they are not used as a way of blocking change. And I don't think that that's happening exactly, but I think that our models for how to do things over the last 20, 30 years are needing some tweaking in order to move forward quickly, to build projects quickly, but also to deal with the fact that we're going to be seeing major changes in neighborhoods that people maybe don't expect. And that is always hard.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I would build on that by saying, these projects, they do change the landscape, and they change it. It hits close to home, like literally close to people's homes, and so it's changes that will impact them, and it's changes to spaces that they care about, and ultimately to protect those spaces themselves. But I think that's why it's also important that when we're contemplating how we design resiliency measures, that we're not simply focused on how do you keep the water out, but in doing that, how are you sensitive to preserving valued uses of the public spaces or adjacent infrastructure and buildings and transportation and what have you. And so that is why community engagement is really important, being transparent about it, but also, soliciting, input as much as you can, but while at the same time balancing that with the need to eventually, get it done.
And explaining why, too. A lot of times you have a project and it's going to be constructed or planned for, and no one in the community quite understands, why at this location and not another location, or why does this have to be done and not this. And so I think explaining the science and explaining the technology behind it is something that is really important for the public. So BJ, you were talking in the very beginning about, you have a broader implementation plan that you're working on. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, our project is comprised of 3 components: the completed ball fields project, which I mentioned earlier, which was site-specific, and we've basically finalized designs and are approaching construction for the south resiliency project for Battery Park City, and that's a project that will, if you are familiar with Battery Park City, it'll run along the southern edge, obviously, protecting the Museum of Jewish Heritage, creating a more resilient Wagner Park, and creating elevation through Pier A and into the historic Battery next door. So, again, talking about those links in a chain. This is a link in a chain that's close to what the city is building as part of LMCR, kind of coming around the bend where we'll lock in together. We're also in, the fairly early design stages for the rest of the perimeter around Battery Park City. So, we're still kind of trying to figure out the alignment and design options and the systems we'll use to create protection along the water's edge and then along the northern edge of Battery Park City. And I should note that, again, because these are projects that, they are part of the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency System, but they also have to have independent utility because you don't want to have to wait until everything is done for the protective measures to have some effect. And so, as we build these, we are building from high point to high point. And so this close collaboration with the city is really important because we go into the city's jurisdiction to achieve that. But as a result, when these are done, we're going to be protecting Battery Park City and beyond, including portions of Lower Manhattan.
And Courtney, you were talking about in some of our prep, some of the legislative victories that you had.
So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Laws need to be passed, especially the state and local level, to make sure that climate resiliency can move forward. So an example is that recently the Rise to Resilience Coalition had a major victory in Albany. Flood disclosure legislation was passed for all new rental leases in New York State. That was something that we worked on for quite a long time. And if you all remember, some of the most terrible, tragic deaths from Hurricane Sandy occurred in basement apartments. And this law would cover legal rentals and require the landlord to release information about the flood risk and historic flooding. And that's a major victory. That type of a law should be passed in every single state. I think the appetite in Congress for passing that and the Senate blocking it, is there. And so I think that action at the state and local level is really important. Another example at the New York City level is that we played a strong role in making sure that the climate design guidelines that New York City had released were no longer voluntary, but are required to be followed for all New York City spending on infrastructure. Those are examples of laws that have to be moved forward through the NGO community and are just critically important in every state and in every municipality.
Keith, can you give us an example of a project that climate change impact type project that Tomorrow.io has done that you feel like has really made an impact?
Absolutely. It starts with at this macro level of think globally and acting locally. Tomorrow.io, as I said, there's this dearth of data, and there's not a great access to weather data and information globally. So first, Tomorrow.io is going to space and is going to have these wonderful constellation of radar and microwave sounders that are going to sort of replace what heretofore governments have been doing. And this is a great example of the commercial sector stepping up and filling a void and using the ability to be agile and use private investment along with some public monies to move it forward very quickly. So that's at the macro level. At the micro level, there's a wonderful project in Hoboken trying to understand and characterize precipitation and understanding that just really relatively small amounts of precipitation have a significant impact in a city like Hoboken, given their vulnerability.
I was in one of the flooding corridors.
And I've got a son living there as well. So yeah, this stuff is up close and personal, as you said. So the ability to arm that city with foreknowledge, the ability to understand in advance when something's going to happen with great certainty and with great precision makes for a better application of emergency resources, where they need to be, when they need to be there. And that gets down to things like, preserving overtime and not having people sitting waiting for something that may or may not happen. So the ability to understand and characterize that at the local level, at this sort of hyper-local level, is going to make a huge difference for municipalities across the country.
And I'd say, Karen, like you were saying, it takes so long for these projects to be built. And that data is critically important in that interim period, so people at least have the information they need to protect themselves.
And the information that they need to understand the smaller projects or smaller, personal type of implementation that can happen to protect cities or businesses or residential buildings or homes.
Well, I think it's how we rally communities as well, right, Karen? When we see that the first park, right, that's been built in Hoboken, that's allowing for water management, and people can see, wow, my life changed. My quality of life is better. My street doesn't flood anymore. So now when you put a referendum on a ballot or ask people to come support something or to line up behind something, right, BJ, that you want to do, people have seen incremental progress and can identify with it.
And hopefully we'll get faster because, the first couple of these projects, Battery Park City and some of the other Sandy, at least in our region, the Sandy funded projects, we're learning a lot from them. I was at a discussion with some colleagues the other day and just talking about, how what we've learned in our area from all these Sandy projects can apply to other projects, and just the processes, the permitting, the easements, the coordination with federal, state, and local agencies, private, companies or private owners and that kind of thing is, it's a wealth of knowledge that's my call to action, right? Oh, I just bumped my microphone. I got excited. That's my call to action, is to take that information out to other places and other projects. Okay, so one of the things that we all agree is important and is simple, but not simple at the same time, is how are we going to live a more resilient everyday life, right? So there's simple things, there's complex things. It's inhabiting our infrastructure, using it, maintaining it, building it. What's one thing that you think needs to happen now? One thing, okay, kidding, that needs to happen now to help us move towards this. Want to start, Keith?
Sure. I think it's to be sort of weather-enabled, weather-knowledgeable. We've all got, some sort of mapping program, mapping app readily available. We're losing our ability to natively navigate, right, because we're wholly dependent on our devices. I don't know that we have the kind of confidence necessarily in weather apps and understanding how it's going to impact both our immediate planning and longer term planning. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us not to become meteorologists, certainly, but to become more aware of what does it mean. Flash flooding used to be a thing that we ignored. I think maybe we heard flash flooding, and that's something that happened somewhere else. It didn't happen in the New York metropolitan area until it did. And just after Ida, watching all the cars that had been flooded sitting on the side of the road, getting hauled away for weeks in northern New Jersey, it's because people were out driving, ignoring the flash flood warnings because it doesn't happen here. So the one thing I'd say is people have to look for the opportunity to take advantage of these advances in weather analytics and climate intelligence and take it on as a personal responsibility in your area to understand what happens when there is a significant weather or climate event, and how will you act instead of react?
Yeah, I would really say, if I had to pick only one thing, is like really, commitment is so important to these initiatives, really at all levels. Resiliency work, I will tell you from personal experience, is a wild ride. It is, it's really hard. It requires engineering feats, political feats, funding feats, urban design feats, interagency collaboration feats. And so, if you are going to go through all of that to get, to the other side, you really have to make sure that there's the political will, the community will, because, individuals can have, different opinions about how they might prefer it be done, but, we share this collective fate when it comes to the next storm. So, just folks have to be committed to, the necessity of this work.
There's so many, but I think that this is changing slowly. But we have run into people feeling like if you start working really hard on climate resilience, you're ignoring climate mitigation and you're ignoring the huge work that has to be done to decarbonize and to get to zero emissions. But actually some of the numbers really reflect that only 14% of the funding for climate goes to climate adaptation. But I think they go hand in hand, and it doesn't mean you're throwing in the towel on climate mitigation if you're committed to climate resilience. And as many of you I'm sure know, there are changes baked in no matter what we do if we were to stop emitting carbon today and other greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's just a really important point, and I think it goes back to everybody needing to get involved in this conversation and be committed. Climate change is going to affect everyone in every neighborhood one way or another. It may not be water. So what can you do to be helpful and to change things?
I think to kind of, add to that, the climate adaptation versus the climate mitigation, when I was thinking about, infrastructure, so there's existing, there's future, and then there's unknown, right? So we can retrofit and modify or redesign existing, and we can plan for a future that we know through tomorrow.io technology could be happening. And then, but how are we planning for the unknown? And it's, if hindsight's 20/20, like if you knew what was going to happen 10 years ago, it'd be a whole different story. But we really need those kind of thought leaders and historical data too that can help us predict. We have to leave room for adaptability of infrastructure. And in a place like New York City, there's not necessarily room for it. So then you have to get really creative and innovative to get there. Okay, so you get one final thought. Anything you want. I'm not going to ask you a question. You can, if there's something that you really wanted to say or just want to have a closing thought, go ahead, Courtney, you can start.
Okay. Well, I went to the Cranes meeting this morning, and Mayor Adams spoke, which was great. But climate change wasn't mentioned once in the entire hour, and it is New York City Climate Week, and it just goes back to one thing I think that people are saying. A lot of the more prominent climate leaders, we have to talk about climate change. You have to make sure if you're in a meeting where anything is discussed related to infrastructure, the future of a region, the future of a city, make sure that climate is part of the conversation at least once in one small piece, because it eventually will become something we all talk about all the time. Let's get started now.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just at the individual level. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but you don't have to be in charge of an authority or an innovative company or an NGO to get involved in resiliency projects, whether they are happening in your neighborhood or not. You should insert yourself in the conversation. You should advocate for where you are and the measures you think are needed, and make sure people understand what you value, and just help continue to build momentum so these things happen, but also happen in as responsible a way as possible.
I think it's to open the aperture and think broadly about possible solutions. There are eye-watering technologies that are available right now, and I'd point out, just in the case of what's happening in Ukraine, the Russians are fighting the last war and the Ukrainians are fighting the next war, and that is functionally the difference of what's going on there. The Ukrainians are data and information enabled, and they are taking, that allows them to have smaller formations, to be more agile, and to take it to the Russians, who are fighting really a World War II style operation. Weather, the challenge of climate, is our adversary, right, in this discussion. And so how do we enable ourselves, how do we take advantage of advances in technology across the board, integrated advances, so smart cities and digital twins, and all the types of things that are happening across architecture, engineering, and construction, the types of things that are happening in city planning and regional planning. There are some phenomenal opportunities here, and just like the Defense Department, the intelligence community is struggling to get beyond the usual suspects, the usual providers. I think we all, in this fight, in this challenge, have to open up the aperture to new and innovative solutions that maybe just a few years ago weren't attainable and now are, and take a chance on some of these things so that we can move forward more quickly.
So I guess my final thought is we didn't get a chance to touch on funding. And I know that especially for infrastructure and large built projects is very important. I think we're hoping that in the industry, we're hoping that the IIJA funding, as it's coming down to the state and local levels, will really help to fund some of these projects. And the policy and the planning that has been done in the few past years and is being done now, with, at least in New York City, there's more planning being done with the new administration, will enable some of these projects to move forward. And we're seeing it in some of the RFPs, the requests for proposals that are coming out. And any actions that we all can do to help get that funding to where we think it needs to go. There's a call to action for you, right? I don't want to say write your congressman, but write your congressman. Well, thank you guys very much. This was fun for us to talk about. I hope you have some kind of new idea or call to action that comes out of this. And thanks again for having us.